I would like to raise the question from my fellow monk, Bante. Can you explain what is the Theravada Buddhist tradition and what are the other schools of Buddhism?
Okay, hello everybody. Mm, So the question is, what is Theravada Buddhism? So in Buddhism there are many schools. There is the Theravada Buddhist tradition, and there's Mahayana and Vajrayana and Zen. All these types of sects are there. Theravada means Thera means the elders. Elders means those who were living with the Buddha, the disciples, and those who followed the teachings of the Buddha and became arahants. That means so the teaching of the Buddha, it describes how to escape from suffering, how to escape from the defilements, greed, hatred, and delusion. So those who fully completed the path are called arahants. Those who have pure minds. So the arahants who were with the Buddha, uh, they learned the teachings of the Buddha. At that time, there were no such thing as different schools or different sects. There was only the teaching of the Buddha. So these arahants, when the Buddha passed away, uh, the arahants at that time they got together and they held the first Buddhist council. 500 arahants got together, led by Venerable Mahakassapa Thera. He's the uh, third foremost disciple in the dispensation of Gautam Buddha. So 500 arahants got together and they held the first Buddhist council. The idea was to establish and preserve the oral tradition and transfer the unaltered teachings of the Buddha to the future. So 500 arahants got together and they recited all the teachings that they memorized. So at that time, they didn't write the teachings of the Buddha in books. They had everything in their mind. They had memorized that. So there was an oral tradition. The teacher would teach the Buddha's teachings to his students, and they would remember all the teachings of the Buddha and will by heart that. And that way, they will transfer to the future generation the teachings of the Buddha. That's how it came for many hundreds of years. So, at the first Buddhist council, the Arahants they handed over the responsibility to some groups of monks, group of sangha, to by heart different parts of the Buddha's teachings and to continue the oral tradition. So it went on like that for about for a century, and there came some problems in the sangha. There were some monks, some groups of monks with different views, and they tried to alter the teachings of the Buddha. So at that time, after about 100 years from the passing away of the Buddha, there were arahants who had practiced all the complete path to purify their minds. So 700 arahants got together and held the second Buddhist council in order to preserve the unaltered teachings of the Buddha. So they didn't want to mix the altered versions of the Buddha's teachings into the Theravada tradition. So Thera means the elders. Elders are the ones, the arahants who did who conducted the Buddhist councils. So in the second Buddhist council, there were 700 arahants. That was held after 100 years from the Buddha's passing away, and about 218 years later, that means from the passing away of the Buddha, after 218 years, uh, at India, they held the third Buddhist council, and to that, 1,000 arahants got together and they recited all the teachings they had memorized and took measures to transfer the teachings into the future, teaching all the Buddhist discourses to their students. So at that time, there were different schools established in the dispensation. That means like Mahayana and Vajrayana. They had different views. They had created some new suttas and they had altered the original teachings of the Buddhas and uh, created their own version. So the Arahants took measures to preserve the original teachings, the authentic teachings of the Buddha. And after the Third Buddhist Council, there was a famous Arahant called Arahant Mahinda, and that Arahant Mahinda came to Sri Lanka. And Arahant Mahinda established the Theravada Buddhist tradition in Sri Lanka. So when it turned 500 years after Buddha's passing away, there were Arahants in Sri Lanka. They realized that it is at that time it was difficult to transfer the teachings of the Buddha orally. That means there were not much people who came into the dispensation to learn and to practice the teachings of the Buddha and memorize all the teachings. So they understood that it is not possible to do it anymore. So the Arahants got together in the Fourth Buddhist Council in Sri Lanka, and they wrote down all the teachings of the Buddha in palm leaves. So now, so literally in books. So we call that the Pali Canon. That is the Tipitaka. The Pali Canon. Now we find all the teachings of the Buddha in the Pali Canon. So generally, it contains all the teachings of the Buddha, and now we can read and learn what the Buddha said in those suttas. So Theravada Buddhist tradition is considered as the oldest and the most conservative and authentic, unaltered version of the Buddha, original teachings of the Buddha. So Thera means the Arahants who conducted the Buddhist councils. So the word of the Arahants, that is the meaning of Theravada. So in the teachings, dear friends, when we learn the teachings, we can see the Buddha. We can see what the Buddha said, how he realized the truth of the world. Many people came to the Buddha and asked questions, and Buddha had answered those questions, and all these conversations are there in the books, in the Pali Canon. So when you read that, we can see the qualities of the Buddha.